the invitation to be here. I really appreciate it. This is an interesting place with all these different experiences, countries, disciplines, to reflect all of us from different experiences, cases, and ideas to the subject of democratization. And well, for me, it's a wild experience also, because I've been discussing with some of you that Peru is facing a very difficult moment precisely this week. So the president of Peru just resigned yesterday under accusations of corruption, and this is a very particular moment. I have the feeling, I already had the feeling while I was coming to this seminar, you know, that the moment of the process of democratization in Peru was coming to an end. And I think it feels very clearly that way right now. So I will have to, I'll try to explain what has happened in the Peruvian case. I want to take the Peruvian case as an example to discuss the challenges and the possibilities of democratization, but I wanted to focus on another process that has been going on and which is entangled with democratization in Peru, and that is neoliberalization. So I want to use this opportunity to reflect on the links between changes and the institutionalization of an economic regime, which is more than an economic regime, and a process that it's supposed to take a country from an authoritarian rule to democratic rule. Oops, I have to do just a second. Wait, mine is not. Okay, so I want to start with some concepts and questions. I just want to define how I'm understanding what I am trying to ask and reflect on, and my points of departure also. So these are the orienting questions. I would like to reflect on this. In the Peruvian case, I'm only claiming here that I'm talking about Peru. What is the relation between neoliberalism and democracy during the process of transition? Has neoliberalism helped or undermined democracy? Another question I'm interested in is, what are the conditions for democratization? How are we to understand democracy, right? Democratization is the process towards democracy, but what kind of democracy are we trying to build? That's a previous question to dealing with the conditions for democratization, right? And finally, how do the political, economic, and social realms interact in this process? I don't want to, I think it is crucial to analyze the political in relation to social and economic dynamics as well. And so my points of departure are these. First, I think democracy requires a socio-historically situated analysis. Context matters, and it matters a lot. And I think our arguments this week about the South African case and the Chilean case, the Argentinian case, and now we're going to see a bit about the Peruvian case, show that also, for example, the meaning of equality and of liberty cannot be assumed to be universal. Every country, every process, every moment has a special particular meaning, and it means a particular struggle also. So in a way, one of my questions is, what kind of equality and what kind of freedom have we been trying to build in Peru? Democratization, I'm understanding it also as a process of institutionalization in a strong sense. And here I'm going to Castoriadis to think of institutions not simply as, you know, a set of laws and norms or institutional design, but also about forms of self-understanding that organize social life, social relations among people. And also, I think we have to consider that there are some previous conditions when democratization happens. Something is already there, right, that helps push changing in the direction of the democratization. But of course, there are also these obstacles to take into account. We have to understand also that change is going to be resisted by some portions or dimensions of society. Finally, democratization in the political level has to be read in its interactions with marketization and equalization. Okay, so I want to start sharing also some of the answers and then going into the Peruvian case. So I'm thinking that a liberal understanding of democracy, and I'm speaking from the Peruvian case, right, leads to electoral democracy, namely to a minimalist definition of democracy. In the Peruvian case, we can see very clearly this. The process focused almost entirely on the implementation of procedures and formal rules for the election of authorities. It left the domains of the social and the economic completely unchallenged. We somehow assumed that electing our fourth president, the one that just fell down, we had consolidated democracy already. You know, it's clearly not the case. Democratization then became a superficial, purely formal enterprise. Meanwhile, neoliberalism has been institutionalized, fully institutionalized, and became the operating regime at the institutional dimension as an economic model, and it's also become, in this long process that I'm going to explain, a particular form of self-understanding at the societal level. So that the social and the political are guided by the principles of neoliberalism that we can, for now, mention as deregulation, privatization, macroeconomic growth. The marketization of politics, that's a process that we've seen also during the Peruvian experience. Turned the small space of the political, and I'm saying small because it's only constricted to the electoral dimension of the political, turned it into an open market, segregated from the social. No parties or channels of mediation survived the transition, I have to say. Our case is very particular. There is no party system in place. We only have these circumstantial alliances from people that put, you know, I mean, if you have the money, right, you rent a party, a franchise, find your allies, and run for office. That's it. After you're elected, you can split. It depends. And for the next election, you can run under a different franchise. It's an open market. So in this situation, representation becomes impossible. The political is totally disconnected from the social and turned into a different kind of market. The expansion of neoliberalism to the social is not unchallenged, though. The politicization of society and self-representation have become an obstacle, as I will describe a little bit later on, but only operate at a defensive, reactive level, exercising a veto power, sometimes, that cannot enter the institutional domain. Okay, now I'm moving into the Peruvian case. And I want to explain a little bit the transition, how it started, what happened, and how it's ending now. So this is the timeline of the transition. In 1991, with the election of President Alberto Fujimori in the middle of a huge economic crisis, we had a hyperinflation during the 80s that made it to the world records. And then we also had a process of internal civil war going on. So these are very, very difficult years. By the end of the 80s, the party system is already collapsed, and the country elects Alberto Fujimori. He's an outsider to politics, the president of a public university that has never been in politics before, and he wins, promising not to do Mario Vargas Llosa, the famous writer, our novel. He runs for office. He's also an outsider, and he's running for office that same year, basically to liberalize the country. He's saying the only way we can stop this economic crisis is with an economic shock. We have to control the economy, and then everything, will get better. So Fujimori runs against that promise, but then he applies the same economic program in 1991 with the support from the World Bank, the FMI, the usual suspects. And so marketization starts before the political change that we're going to see now. He gives the economic shock. In 1992, authoritarianism starts. The president gives a coup d'etat. This is the first in a country, full of military coups. A democratically elected president gave a coup and concentrated power in the executive, took over the judiciary and Congress with support from the military and economic elites. In 1993, we can say that neoliberal regime starts turning into a regime. We have a new constitution in place in 1993, sanctioning a market economy and launching a state reform to secure this economic but also political reforms. So we're also talking a lot about the minimal state, which is not small at all. It's a huge apparatus just doing things differently with regards to the economy and the people. And then in 95, we have the consolidation of electoral authoritarianism. Fujimori introduced a re-election clause in the constitution, so he got re-elected in 1995. In 1997, people saw clearly that the president wanted to stay for a third consecutive period, which was not allowed by his own constitution. Still, he said that he was going to run again, and that's when street protests start crystallizing around the message of new elections. So new elections become the core of the demand of the protests in the country. In 2000, Fujimorismo falls and a transition begins. It falls among a corruption scandal, human rights violations, but also the disintegration of the ruling elite. So Fujimorismo falls, a transition begins, and then we have a new president, Alejandro Toledo, who had participated also in the street protests in the transition, but he has no political party behind. He's basically alone, and he's seen as a centrist. Then we have Alan Garcia, who had been already president before Fujimori and is responsible for the huge economic crisis of the country, but he was re-elected again in 2006. His party is almost non-existent. It's one of these franchises. And he's seen as left-leaning, centered to the right. He's elected, under promises of working on redistribution of social and economic resources. But just as Toledo and Fujimori at his moment, he breaks his promises in about 2 months and conducts a rightist government. It's just like that. In 2000, sounds familiar. In 2011, we have Ollanta Humala, who is a leftist. He is elected president, no political party again, but just as the others, he breaks his promises. It takes him a little more, 6 months, and then he turns around the block and makes the same old rightist government. And finally, we have this Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, who is a rightist, but we elected him only because Fujimorismo had come back strongly to the electoral competition, and so the people mobilized against Fujimorismo strongly and elect this rightist, non-Fujimorista president. But at this point, and this is when I thought this is over for us. I mean, this is the end of our transition. That's what I thought when we had to elect Kuczynski, because that's the thing. We had to elect a president that was not an alternative, There are no alternatives, the system is not competitive. So if you have a democracy that even under minimal standards, it doesn't match the minimal standards of the minimalistic definition, what are you talking about? I think at that point, when political alternation showed to be impossible, that's when we saw the limits of this transition. So the transition ended just now, but it went through a very difficult process that implied a confrontation between the president and Congress. It's reached the institutional level, and the president has resigned just as the Fujimori in its moment, amidst corruption scandals that reveal that corruption is being institutionalized. I can't go into details, but yesterday I spent my whole day watching videos of congressmen being paid to vote against the vacancy of the president, all kinds of negotiation among all kinds of politicians at every level, you know, at the Congress, but also majors, regional presidents. Mostly everybody is into this. So the question is, how did we get here? What happened? Well, I want to say something about the accompanying conditions of the process of political change. The most important thing is that the transition did not imply questioning the economic model. On the contrary, political actors at the National Agreement Conciliation during the transition considered it important to secure its continuation. Thus, prioritization of international capital, deregulation, the limitation of social investments from the state continued. That was like a consensus of the representatives that got into the negotiating table, even though they didn't represent anybody anymore. Macroeconomic growth has been, since then, the priority of all elected governments, and they have all delivered in this matter. So GDP in Peru grows at a miraculous pace. We've been called the milagro peruano, you know, the Peruvian miracle, because we had this hyperinflation in the 80s, and then in the first years of the 21st century, you see an average of 6% of annual growth, with peaks 10% in the year of the crisis, 2008, not bad, and our lowest is 3%. We always grow. Sounds great. And macroeconomic growth has, of course, helped reduce poverty in statistical terms, right? But not inequality. So poverty levels, and by this I mean people living with $2 per day, right? Are about 25%. And extreme poverty, people living with just $1, less than 5%. The problem is inequality. 20% of the population enjoys over 50% of the nation's wealth, while 60% controls only 25%. But inequality is also linked to the devaluation of state-provided services. Access to education is over 95%. It's a very good number, but the quality of education is extremely poor after legislation that liberalized the school and university market. So we have very, very low quality schools and universities everywhere. Cheap, they will give you, you know, your degree just for a little money, basically. That's the thing. And then the unemployment rate is not bad. It's about 8%, but the real problem is subemployment and growing informality, you know, the conditions in which people have to work. Another important thing to say is what I mentioned already, the debacle of the system of political representation was never addressed during the transition. In practice, it meant that no forms of mediation between society and political authorities had adequate functional channels. It became impossible to translate demands coming from society into the political, and also to articulate them into any form of alternative economic or political project. The crisis of the party system, the lack of efficient mechanism of democratic control, the elitism and alienation of representatives, and the preeminence of bureaucratic, technocratic, and financial power exposed the shortfalls of representative democracy and the devaluation of the idea of representation itself. And then what we have is that people opted for self-representation. We have huge levels of social mobilization, street protests every day in basically all the country, and that's like the way that people find to participate in politics, challenging the ruling elites, the local elites, trying to redefine the contours and dynamics of the public sphere and turning it into a counter-hegemonic, conflictive, sometimes very violent public sphere. So what is happening in the streets, I think it is resistance. It's over 20 years of resistance. It takes the form of self-representation. And we could say that it's a way of political engagement, but that sometimes, when it is successful, can destabilize and for governments into receding or canceling some decisions. But it cannot orient policy or politics. You know, in the best case scenario, it enacts a veto power over the government, but it can change the course of action of the government. I want to show just a few pictures from the protests of all these years. This is Marcha de los Cuatro Suyos, the original one against Fujimori. This is a very emotional moment also, you know, with the flag. It's the idea of the nation recovering the country, the political. It was a long, long fight, several years it took to, you know, create a movement, 3 years for this kind of movement to crystallize. But then in 2002, Alejandro Toledo, the newly elected president, had to deal also with protests because of his broken promises. You know, but he was quick in sending in the police. Still, he lost. I'm showing here pictures of protests that won over presidents in the course of the decision. This is Bawa, the one that, for Alan Garcia. You know, this one, a lot of people was killed. This is indigenous people from the Amazon in Peru killed by the police, and many, many disappeared people. It ended with Congress legislating in favor of the law of previous consultation for the indigenous. It was a huge setback for the government. This is Conga for the leftist president, Humala, who also went to this region in the country where you have these very important extractive projects. Cajamarca, in the north of Peru, is well known for because it's rich in gold. You know, it's an emblematic region since the time that the Spaniards came to this part of the country. So. These are rural communities, peasant communities in the Andes, in Cajamarca, that also mobilized to defend the lagoons. Because they do have, it's not only about, you know, money or poverty, they do have a different understanding also of what development, progress, a good life is. So they believe that the lagoons are alive, inhabited, alive, and that they are also integrated to this what they would call ecosystems, right? So there is this huge mining company, Newmont Corporation, that proposed, they found, there are these 4 huge lagoons here in Cajamarca. So they find gold, big gold, what do you say? Deposits under 2 of the lagoons. So what they say is, okay, so we're going to empty 2 lagoons so that we can drain the other 2 and put all the waste in all these 2. And in exchange, we will give you these huge pools, you know, full of water, and everything will be fine. It's going to be just the same, you know. And so the people, these are agrarian peasant communities, right? They say, are you nuts? I mean, first you wanna kill the lagoons, right? Then you wanna contaminate all of our lands and environments, and so this is a very, very long process. And President Humala went there and gave this wonderful speech and said, "Can you drink gold? Can you drink gold? Let's defend the water." And then he becomes president, and of course he passes on the mining project, right? So the people protested, and then again Conga is stopped. You know, it's not going forward. The struggle continues. The struggle continues. So this is a big reversal for President Humala. And then in 2016, this is a picture of a protest in Lima, right before the election of Kuczynski. Kuczynski is elected because he promises not to pardon Fujimori, which he just did in December, right? So there is this capacity to articulate massive amounts of people, multitudes really, but that come in together just for very particular demands or purposes, mostly to try to avoid or halt something that they consider is crucial or is defining. Okay, now I want to talk about the institutionalization of neoliberalism. I already said that democracy was not institutionalized, and that's why I consider this a failed process. But neoliberalism was institutionalized, and that happened at very different levels. So the national project of economic growth, and I want to draw here, I want to think about the cultural dimension, and thinking also that for neoliberalism to be institutionalized, it has to be, for it to be successful, it has to capture our imagination. Somehow it has to convince us, all of us, that that's the best possible way to live our lives. And somehow it's done that. So, and I just show you how the Peruvian state, these 4 different governments have been also involved in advancing a new national project of rebranding or rethinking national identity. So the national project of economic growth is paired with the transformation of national identity. But this time the identity, it's a brand, right? So it's the institutionalization of neoliberalism that requires the reconstruction of the collective imagination. And so now we don't talk about Peru as a nation, the descendant of the Incas and all that stuff. I mean, of course we are descendants from the Incas, but the best part of our country is our food, as I'm sure all of you know, right? So ceviche, it's the new big thing, and the pisco, and basically what we have to do to be successful is sell it everywhere. We have to sell the country to other people, and that's how we progress. So it's not really a nationalistic project. It fights all the time every kind of, you know, form of remembrance, of collective memory, of dealing with problems or claims of injustice from the past. It's all about the future and securing the insertion of the country in the international market. And here I'm quoting, you know, a few parts of the way that the office that it's in charge of working around the Marca Peru say. So they say, we all make Peru. Peru is a big brand, and we are all invited to be its ambassadors. So it is a command from the state, you know. The new collective project is the commercial mandate of selling the country in international markets to secure macroeconomic growth. We are responsible for that. They also say there is a Peru for everyone. Each person traces his own path according to its particular interests. On the other hand, we're not a collective or a community anymore. You know, somehow every person is responsible to advance his or her own terms. And here you can see a picture. This is our leftist president, Humala, now imprisoned. Yes, he's Nadine in prison at Wall Street, September 26th, Thursday, and you can see the national flag and the Marca Peru, the new national symbol.
Coca-Cola.
It's like
That's so horrible. Yeah, but you know that, well, and so they are all happy. This is the kind of success they are hoping for. Right? Here's the Marca Peru.
We don't see that.
Oh, sorry.
That's the brand.
It's the brand.
You've got a flag and a brand.
Yeah, but mostly nowadays we only see the brand. Still has the colors of the flag, you know, there is, and it goes back somehow to our pre-colonial heritage, because it resembles one of Línea de Nazca's civilizations in Peru. So we go back to that very old past. We don't go to the recent past, for example, the internal war, the kind of past we don't like. We can go back centuries, but not 20, 25 years. But then, of course, there is resistance, and this is, for example, a poster. It says the only dialogue, the only public dialogue we've had is this, you know, the police, the armed police, because that's how the government deals. I mean, it has all these different procedures and dialogue tables to discuss, negotiate the resolution of conflicts, but the majority of them are addressed in this way. There is an amazing and very interesting proliferation of political critique in art. It's flourishing. You can see here a reinterpretation of Marca Peru, right? This is a bag full of shots, and those shots are brand. That's one I like. Okay, so now I want to go into some preliminary conclusions. I wanted to understand the relations between the social, the economic, and the political in this process. And so I think it is important here to work on a critique to democratic transitions and consolidation literature. First, for not taking seriously into account the relations between these, or among these three different dimensions of social life. Not even Linz and Stepan, that I would say are the most progressive ones, arguing about the 5 arenas of democratization, speaking about the social, the political, the economic, civil society, political society, right? The rule of law, of course, etc. Not even them work on trying to understand what are the ways in which the social, the economic, and the political are linked to each other. How do they relate to each other? Is it possible that the process of democratization would be undermined from the way the economic dimension works? They don't ask that kind of questions. And so here I'm thinking with Charles Taylor that liberalism has this implicit tension between the construction of a political egalitarian society, right? This is Charles Taylor in Modern Social Imaginaries, saying that liberalism has this bifocal understanding, that a society that sees it as an egalitarian community in the public sphere, in the political realm, and as a competitive community, or not a community, a competitive group of people that has to that advance individual particular interests. So this is, he says that this is liberalism. Liberalism's conception of the social, it's schizophrenic, right? You can have it both ways. So this internal tension has to be resolved somehow. I think in the Peruvian case, we can see how it plays out. So I would say that in Peru, what has happened is that the economic system became a source of production and reproduction of equality. Poverty and extreme poverty decreased, but not inequality. And inequality reinforced what Charles Tilly calls categorical inequalities, right? He has this article that I like a lot about democratization, inequality, democratization, and de-democratization. And he says that democratization requires addressing categorical inequalities, namely those that are socially instituted, rooted in the economic, the social, and that imply disadvantages in the political, the economic, and such as ethnicity, gender, language, etc. So what we find is that economic inequality reinforces social inequality and erodes the possibility of full and universal citizenship. Then social inequality is reinforced by the competitive mandates of neoliberalism. Atomism is deeply ingrained in the image of the entrepreneurial subject, the emprendedor, who has to do it, who has to do everything alone. You know, he or she can be successful, but he has to compete against other people. And so it runs against the idea of a community, of solidarity, and even of social equality. Competition then organizes social life, not collaboration. And then we have the state that does not want to interact with collectivities or organized groups. This is a trend that we saw during Fujimori's populist type of leadership. You know, Fujimori has been called a neo-populist because he was a populist in the usual leftist sense, but he did not want to relate, or again, his clients were not parties, you know, the people from his party, because he did not have a party, or social organizations. He wanted to relate to people as individuals, and he found a way to do that, to allocate money in individual terms, and to secure individual ties. So this neoliberal state does not interact anymore with collectivities or organized groups. It rather deals and negotiates with individual subjects, and that are also in the semantics of the state, less and less citizens and more consumers, beneficiaries, victims, the poor, etc. Whatever you want to call them, not citizens. And political inequality is then reproduced and expanded via the progressive disenfranchisement of citizens. We have also, this is another trend that runs unparalleled despite regime change, the formal cancellation of previously acquired rights. But also the inefficiency of the state in guaranteeing or securing universal rights. So the state has worked a lot and efficiently the supreme previously acquired rights, but also the ones that it offers or secures, the services it provides, it does it poorly, badly. And then there is, of course, the progressive exclusion of citizens as valid interlocutors of the state. And here I like Rancier's idea that the dialogical structure underpinning public disagreement and social conflict exposes these forms of exclusion. You know, he talks about this performative contradiction. People who formally, legally, theoretically exercises full membership in a community of equals, that are supposed to be all citizens, are denied recognition of their status as such. When they forcefully demand recognition and answers to pressing demands, are ignored, vilified, silenced. At that moment, the structure of inequality is revealed, Rancière says. Well, and thus, to conclude, what I see is that democratization failed because the rationale of marketization effectively expanded and colonized the social and political spheres of society. The consequences of this colonization are clearly visible today, and dramatically so for us in Peru in this week. It has eroded the understanding of the public common good and of community of peers that works for their own freedom. It's also eroded the functioning of political institutions where the advancement of particular and individual interests is seen as normal and even legitimate, opening the door to all kinds of transactions and negotiations concerning the appropriation of public resources. Open competition for the control of public goods leads to extended corruption, and it's become somehow normalized. The political transition in the end favored the deepening of neoliberalism and its institutionalization, which undermined even the most basic and formalistic functioning of democratic institutions. What I wanted to say there, because of its ethos. A more substantial concept of democracy must include an analysis of the dynamics between the social, the economic, and the political, to understand how do we foster democracy when we're dealing with all these different understandings of the social, the people, progress, rights. How does equality and freedom, what does equality and freedom mean, and how are they going to be achieved? Well, the two final, I write them, you know, in full hope that something like this is possible. I don't know if the Peruvian case, this is, I just can't see how can we turn, you know, the situation right now in our country. This is a moment in which everything seems to be suspended up in the air. There is no president right now. The president has resigned. The vice president is coming from Canada, where he was ambassador. But Congress has already promised to give him fight. You know, they won't go down easily. And so it is very unclear where are we going. On the other hand, the street that used to be strong and articulated seems discouraged at this point. I haven't heard of any mobilizations. Maybe today it's a different day, and we'll see how it goes. But it's clearly the end of a particular moment in which we thought that the political could be changed without touching the economic system or altering social inequalities, social divisions. And I think that we can see now that that is clearly not the case. Thank you.
Thank you.